All right, guys, I wanted to go over a few things from the other day with the Crusades. I think we were a bit rushed at the end and there might have been a little confusion. So I just wanted to go over a few things, why the Crusades happened, who was fighting, and ultimately why it matters, the end result. So keep in mind at the very beginning that during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was incredibly powerful, and in particular, the popes were incredibly powerful. They were at the top of the social pyramid in the Middle Ages. They were very wealthy. They were very influential. They were the spiritual head of the church in the Middle Ages, which was the focal point of all things that went on in a community. So the Pope had a large amount of power and influence, and the Pope at the time that we were talking about at the beginning of the Crusades, Pope Urban II, was very nervous about a group called the Seljuk Turks. The Turks had an empire in what we call the Middle East, and they were spreading toward the Holy Land, specifically the city of Jerusalem, which made Urban II very, very nervous. And so his solution was to gather as much support as he could from European Christians in order to lead a fight toward the Seljuk Turks, toward the Muslims, and defeat them, kick them out of Jerusalem, and reclaim that land for the Catholic Church. So, again, the two main sides here were Christians on one side from Europe and Muslims on the other side, the Turks. Recall that in the First Crusade, many peasants went forward. The speech that you read from Pope Urban II in 1095 AD, he discussed giving forgiveness of sins to all peasants and people who died fighting in a crusade. And that encouraged many people to go out and fight. And the peasants, however, that went and tried to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christians, they were untrained, unskilled, didn't know how to fight, and therefore they were defeated pretty easily. But many knights came along soon afterwards and were able to defeat the Muslims and capture most of Jerusalem in the Holy Land for the Christians. However, they hadn't conquered all of the territory that they wanted, so a few decades later, a second crusade was led, and this time the Catholic Crusaders were defeated by the Muslims, a failure in that second crusade for the European Christians. A little bit later on, they led a third crusade. You might recall the name King Richard the Lionheart. So here was yet another attempt to reclaim the Holy Land by European Crusaders. They were again defeated, and the Muslims retained control of the Holy Land. Finally, you read about the Fourth Crusade. This was perhaps the most devastating of all to the Europeans, in which they attempted to reclaim the Holy Land, but also protect Constantinople, which was an important Christian city in the late Roman Empire and in the Byzantine Empire that came along afterwards. So it was an important city to the Christians. They wanted to protect it and regain Jerusalem. The problem was it quickly fell apart, and the Christians, instead of protecting Constantinople, attacked it, destroyed parts of it, burned it, and robbed what they could find. So ultimately, the Crusades, and here is a crusader, what the typical knight would have worn. The Crusades were a major failure for the Europeans. They were unable to retake the Holy Land, so it stayed under Muslim control. But it did allow people to leave their manors, their homes for the first time. Many peasants that were given the opportunity to explore, to see new parts of the world. They were exposed to new products and spices, especially things like sugar and pepper, and that changed their lives significantly, but also made them much more curious about the world around them. And eventually, as we'll see, that's going to lead to the age of exploration and men like Christopher Columbus who wanted to see what lay outside of Europe altogether. So that's a quick review of what the Crusades were all about. Now, the tie-in to our world today. Oftentimes, a crusade is used to refer to a war or a fight for a particular cause or for a belief, whether it's religious or political or anything else, really. Someone's fighting for a cause, something that they believe in, refer to it as a crusade sometimes. Our last two presidents, President Bush and President Obama have both used the term crusade at different times. In some cases, they were criticized for it. George Bush, right after 9/11, he gave a speech in which he referred to a crusade into the Middle East to stop terrorism, and many people were upset that he said that, claiming that was referring to a very dangerous and sad time in history, major conflict between Muslims and Christians, and that he was conjuring up these bad memories. And President Obama, more recently, he used the term crusade, referring to religious violence, not just by Muslims, but by Christians as well. And so many people criticized him, saying that that was an unfair comparison between Christian crusaders and terrorists today. Either way, these are examples of how the Crusades are still referenced today, but also much of the conflict that we see in the Middle East these days can date back to the Crusades and the territorial and religious fighting that happened nearly 1,000 years ago.